training can be provided in different formats, so e-seminars, webinars like this one, workshops, information statements and case studies, etc. The output is all on two open access websites. So the first one is the Government Chemist website, and the second one is the Food Authenticity Network website on the training pages. So if there's an authenticity element, it's loaded on the latter, but all the content is available freely on the Government Chemist website. And then Elena will post both those links in the chat at some stage today. We'll also post in the chat a quick questionnaire on this feedback and any suggestions you have for future e-seminars and webinars. I would appreciate if you take a couple of minutes to fill that out for us, please. Just to let you know that in the first 3-year programme, these were the outputs of the of this framework agreement. And as you can see there, we had some workshops as well as lots of e-seminars, which I said is freely available on those websites that I mentioned. For the second 2-year programme, which started in April 2020, these are the topics that were prioritised. So Year 1 projects on the left and Year 2 projects on the right. Some of the Year 1 projects have been published and we're working through most of the others now. And you can see that fourth on the left-hand side is the fifth on the left-hand side is the Global Honey Supply Chain Seminar, which is this one here as a webinar, and it will be followed by an e-seminar that you can access on the website very soon as well. That brings me to the end of my quick introduction, and I'm just going to introduce our speakers for today now. So our first speaker, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Michelle McQuillan from DEFRA. Michelle is a team leader of the Food Compositional Standards team at DEFRA's Agri-Food Chain Directorate. She is responsible for policy on specific foodstuffs, of which honey is one. Michelle was involved in the negotiations on the Honey Directive in 2001, a long time ago, so is very experienced in this field, and most recently its amendment in 2014. Following Michelle's talk, we're very happy to be joined by Cahill Hennigan, who's the Procurement Director at Value of Foods UK, which owns Rouse Honey, the UK's leading honey packer. Cahill is chairman of the British Honey Imports and Packers Association and represents the association at national and EU level. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Michelle now, who'll talk us through the UK legislative and policy overview on the global honey supply chain. Thank you. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Silverani. Okay, so I'm going to try and share my screen, and let's hope that technology works. Right. Can we see that? Can everyone see it?
Yeah, I can see it, Michelle.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay, so I'll do it in the slide viewer to make it a bit easier for people, hopefully. There we go. Everyone can still see it? Yeah?
Yes.
Yes.
I'll assume someone will tell me if they can. Okay, so thank you very much, Silverani, for that introduction. And I'm really delighted to have been asked by Government Chemists to give this brief introduction, and I hope what is just a whistle-stop tour around the legislative background that surrounds honey. It's lovely to see so many attending. Over 400, I think, did I hear someone say? So that's amazing, and it's so good to see that so many people are interested in honey. Okay, then I suggest we get cracking, and I'll quickly run through what the honey regulations are across the UK. So, okay, so today I'm going to give a very brief outline. I'll focus mostly on the domestic landscape, touch on a little bit about enforcement of the honey rules, and then at the end just sort of round off with a sort of brief bit of background on international standards and how they fit in with our work here. Okay, let's go to that. So in the UK, we have rules across the 4 nations covering honey, and I'm going to focus really on England because that's the legislation that I deal with. So I'm, as Silverani said, I deal with the policy and the legislation on honey for England, and work for DEFRA. So the main piece of legislation that provides the legislative background for marketing honey in England and in the UK is the Honey England Regulations 2015. They provide the sort of detailed background of honey, but we've also got some other legislation which provides sort of a horizontal backstop, if you like. So we've got the Food Safety Act. There's General Food Law Regulation, which was an EU regulation, which has now been retained in UK law. And we've got Food Information to Consumers, which is basically food labelling information as it was originally known. And then there are other rules that touch on honey, so contaminants, veterinary medicines, products of animal origin, which is the POAO, which do touch on later on in the slides and have spelled it out. So forgive me for not spelling it out initially. So that's the relevant legislation in England. Across the 3 other nations of the UK, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there are very similar rules that apply. Obviously, the UK has now left the EU, but in terms of Northern Ireland, under the Northern Ireland Protocol, they will still retain the EU rules and still apply them. But because honey, honey originally was implemented into UK law under the EU directive 2001/110 and its subsequent amending directive, which came around in 2014. So in terms of before and after exit, there's not really been that much difference for honey, because honey was a directive, which meant that we had to implement it directly into national law. So the 4 nations already had their own separate pieces of legislation because it was a directive as opposed to a regulation. And I won't go into the differences between the 2. But largely, I think we can say that since we've left the EU, the rules are broadly based on what the directive is, what the directive is in Europe. There are a few changes that we had to make as a much result of exit, and I'll go into them later on in the slide. Okay, so why do we have specific rules on honey? Why do we think that's important? So one of their key aims is obviously to protect consumers and to ensure that we can instill consumer confidence that honey is what it says it is. We do that by creating a reserved description for honey and by setting minimum compositional standard and minimum expectation for what we expect honey to meet when sold on our market. And one of the other key aspects actually is around creating a level playing field for industry. I mean, surprisingly, in a lot of food regulation, we've removed a lot of red tape, but actually we find that industry are actually quite keen on having regulation quite often in the food space because it provides that level playing field and ensures that everyone's playing to the same rules and that there's fair trading. And of course, crucially, ultimately with honey, it's obviously a high value product. We want to ensure that we can prevent misleading or fraudulent practices on our particular market. So what do the Honey England regulations broadly cover? So first of all, it's very specific in that the honey rules apply only to Apis mellifera, which is a European honeybee, and we find the regulations will lay down quite detailed reserved descriptions relating to either the source of what the honey is from, so things like honeydew and blossom honey are defined. It also defines the process by which it can be sold as honey, so it covers things like extracted and drained honey. And then, of course, there is also some definitions around the way the honey is presented. So things like comb honey, filtered honey, and baker's honey as well are also defined. So as well as having those sort of key definitions, the honey regulations also have firstly a set of general specifications. One is sort of setting a range of general quality criteria that the honey needs to meet, and that's sort of very broad in terms of it describes its colour, its consistency, the flavour and aroma that you would expect from a honey. And one of the important points that's sort of key in that is that it makes it clear that no additions except for other honey and no pollen or constituent particle to honey, and I'll read this out because this is what the regulation says, may be removed. And that's actually quite key in terms of protecting honey and ensuring that it is what it says it is. The other aspects to it are that it needs to be free from organic or inorganic matters that are foreign to its composition, and it mustn't have any foreign tastes or odours added to it. It shouldn't have begun to ferment or have an artificially changed acidity, and it also shouldn't be heated in any way that would destroy the natural enzymes that are present or in honey. So they're the sort of general criteria, and then it's also got a set of detailed specific compositional requirements where it prescribes levels in many cases for things like the sugar content. So specifically it says how much fructose and glucose content should be in honey. It also sets limits for moisture content, water insoluble content and electrical conductivity, and as also mentioned, free acid diastase and hydroxymethylfurfural limits. And in order to be sold as honey, you need to meet the required reserved descriptions and also all of these general criteria and specific criteria in order to call your product honey. And if it doesn't meet those, then you cannot use the reserved description honey or any of the other definitions that I mentioned in the previous slides. One of the other aspects that the honey rules deal with is labelling. Now, general food labelling of all food is covered in, as I mentioned previously, the Food Information to Consumers regulations, and they lay down sort of general rules. But then honey, the honey regulations have got some additional requirements on honey labelling, and they're one of the few commodities where mandatory country of origin labelling is required. So if you are selling your honey in this country, you need to make sure that you have the country of origin labelled on the honey, and that's because consumers quite often buy honey for their origin and want to know this sort of information. Now, when we were making these regulations, and also when they stem from the EU directive, there was recognition that blended honey could prove to be quite tricky if you've got a lot of different honeys in a blend, and particularly if the honeys are changing depending on availability or seasonality, then it makes it quite difficult for honey packers and honey, those that are marketing their honey, to have to keep changing the label. So for honey blends, there is alternative wording, and we've recently changed that as a result of EU exit, because it used to say the EU rules require it to say whether that blend of honey is from the EU, not from the EU, or whether it's from both. And in England and across the UK, we have changed to provide an alternative to mandatory country of origin for blended honey to say blend of honeys from more than one country or something very similar to that. This is the case across the 4 nations, as I said, but in Scotland they have still allowed this sort of EU, non-EU terminology, should you wish to do that. And obviously Northern Ireland will still be adhering to the EU rules on not EU and EU, non-EU terminology. The honey regulations also allow for additional optional labelling. So you can label the floral origin of the honey or the vegetable origin, but if you label a honey as, you know, from a floral source, then it must come wholly and mainly from that source, and it must possess the required characteristics of that source that you would expect. Similarly, you can use terms that would be considered regional or territorial or topographical, so things like mountain honey or whatever could be used, but again, it must come entirely from that origin in this case. Some of you might be thinking, well, what's going to happen with the different rules in the EU and non-EU? But the rules that our new rules on sort of blends of honey from more than one country, we believe you would still be able to use sort of EU, non-EU origin descriptors if you wanted on a voluntary basis, provided you still use the term that we require in the England rules of blend of honeys from more than one country. So it is possible. I know that in terms of marketing the honey, what most industry are concerned about is having to change labels. So having both on the label would probably suffice for that and avoid a lot of label changes for the industry. Okay. In terms, I just thought it might be useful to focus on the enforcement of the honey rules. So, well, DEFRA have responsibility for making the policy, if you like, around honey and actually making the honey regulations, enforcement of honey and a range of other food rules are down to the FSA, so they have the oversight of food enforcement policy and can take a sort of more broad look at that. The actual enforcement on the ground is actually carried out by local authorities, so that will likely be your trading standards officers or EHOs in London and the port health authorities for honey that's imported. And they will adopt a risk-based approach on enforcement. In terms of the actual sanctions, we have moved away from criminal sanctions on honey, and we now use an improvement notice approach. So that's the approach that enforcement officers would be using. But if you fail to comply with an improvement notice issued by the TSO or the EHO, then there is a backstop criminal sanction for failure to comply, and that would can involve a fine and obviously would be subject to the courts. Additionally, on honey, it is a product of animal origin, and there is POAO, and because of that, it is subject, when it's imported to the UK, subject to mandatory checks. So there'll be 100% documentary checks, and around 50% of the honey will be sampled, and further additional checks will be carried out by the Port Health Authority, and that could be ranging from checking to see that it really is honey, looking in the drum, or to sending off for analysis and conducting a suite of tests. And obviously you've got the honey regulations itself. Some of the key quality indicators, as we said, that are set down in the honey rules, but there are other non-permitted additions, such as things like added sugars, which are not specifically listed in the honey regulations, but because of the way they're worded, it is implicit that things like, so the phrase that we refer to often is that no pollen or constituent particle to honey may be removed except where this is unavoidable in the removal of foreign inorganic or organic matter. I think we all recognise that honey is indeed quite a complex matrix, and testing and analysis can be quite challenging, and we have ongoing work, the Food Standards Agency, DEFRA, and Government Chemist to help with that work where issues have developed. In terms of enforcing, we also enforcers would use a weight of evidence. We would recommend enforcers use a weight of evidence approach, particularly for exogenous sugars, which is obviously quite topical, and we've seen things in the press over the past few years. And as well as that, we would also expect any issues to be followed up with traceability checks and follow-up investigations by local authorities. So that's sort of the domestic environment, and I thought I'd just touch on briefly the international sort of environment. And the main international standard that we are involved in and that we take note of is the Codex standard for honey. And that was adopted in 1981, and it's been revised on subsequent occasions, most recently in 2001, when it was done under the Codex Committee of Sugars, which is one of the Codex commodity committees. And that meeting actually took place in the UK, in London. And that was one of the sort of first jobs I think that I can remember that I was ever part of. I was just a young whippersnapper at the time, and I found it absolutely fascinating to see how sort of negotiations on international standards take place. So just in case anyone's not aware, that so Codex it's known as the Codex Alimentarius Commission, and it's a food and agricultural FAO organisation and World Health Organization sponsored body, and it develops food standards across the international sphere. And its main aim is to protect consumers, protect their health, and ensure there is fair practice in the trade of agricultural and food products. The UK actually hold the chair of the CSA currently. That's Mr. Steve Worm, who was appointed at the last meeting at the beginning, at the end of last year. And we are really keen to ensure that we feed into Codex, particularly now that we've left the EU. It's an increasingly important body. It serves as a basis for national law in many countries who don't have their own specific law, so they often just use the Codex standard and adopt that as their national law. And in many cases, the World Trade Organization also will use a Codex standard to settle trade disputes between different countries. So the Codex standards have increasingly an important role to play in trade. Interestingly, I thought I'd just do, well, I mean, broadly the Codex standard and our regulations are quite similar, and there obviously are some different subtleties. One of the main ones is the Codex standard covers honey produced from all honeybees and not just Apis mellifera. It does the same job in terms of establishing sort of the names and properties and the labelling of honey. Interestingly, origin labelling is optional, as you probably would imagine, so some countries in the international sphere are not keen on origin labelling, so it's left up to the country that you are importing your honey to mandate. So that's so that's broadly the Codex standard. In terms of other international work, the ISO and British Standards Institute have got a bee products committee, the bee which are working on looking at new standards for honey, particularly working on definitions and terminology, and looking at the analytical methodology that sits behind some of the honey rules. There's also some work on SEN, who are focused on methods. And of course, in the international sphere, there are many countries who have their own specific rules, i.e. the EU, the United States of America, Australia, New Zealand, and many others. So when you're trading in honey, you obviously need to be aware of what the rules are in other countries, what the international standards say, in order to make sure you're compliant. And in our work on honey, we work with a lot of different key stakeholders, which I thought it was probably just worth mentioning. So here in Britain, we've got the British beekeepers and the British bee farmers. We also work with the Honey Association, who tend to be importing honey and repacking it here. We also have some dialogue with Apimondia, who are the international beekeepers, and the European professional beekeepers, and Copa-Cogeca, who work on the European front in terms of bee farmers. So there's lots of different stakeholders, and across government we want to ensure that we get a good view of what or take account of people's viewpoints, and anytime we would sort of be amending rules on honey, we would ensure that we would be consulting widely on any changes. Okay, so I think that's a whistle-stop tour of the honey rules. Do feel free to follow up later after the meeting if you want to, if you've got any specific questions for me. Thank you very much, and I hope you found it valuable. I'm going to pass on now to Cathal, obviously, who will give you a bit more detail about the sort of global honey supply chain, and I'm very much looking forward to listening. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. I have a little bit of an echo there. I'm not sure. Somebody's got a microphone on. I'm just going to share my presentation now. I'm assuming everybody can see the presentation of that, so I'll give a start.
Yeah, thanks, Cathal. We can see that. Go ahead.
Okay. So by way of introduction, the content of this seminar is intended to provide a general introduction to the honey supply chain. In doing so, I will touch on a number of different topics in what can be a very complicated subject. The supply of honey begins with the bees and the beekeepers, so I will do a brief overview of both. In addition, there are aspects of relevant legislation which I will highlight, and which will include the control of pest and disease, honey composition, some of which Michelle has touched on, and the control of the export and sale of honey. I will also look at the global market for honey, its production, as well as the export process, traceability, and vulnerability of honey to food fraud. In the first section, we look at bees and beekeeping and the relevant regulations and guidelines that apply to honey and its production from a UK perspective. I'm sure that many of you are aware that beekeeping and the production of honey has been practiced for thousands of years all over the world. No one origin can lay claim to beekeeping and what is right or wrong, as practices differ around the world and have adapted and developed local cultures and ecosystems. Honey is not the only product or benefit associated with bees and beekeeping, as bee products such as royal jelly, pollen and propolis are significant in their own right, while pollination is a large-scale commercial activity in many countries. Honey, however, is the key output of beekeeping, and it's an extremely versatile product whose consumption and use has expanded over time. As we see it, it is used as a sweetener, as a condiment. It has obviously reported health benefits. It's used in the production of alcohol. It is used in ingredients in many other food products, in confectionery and baking. It is used in tobacco, pharmaceutical and cosmetic products. So as you can see, it is an extremely versatile and well-used product. It is also important to note that as much as there are numerous nectar sources, types of bees, climatic and environmental conditions, and beekeeping practices around the world, there are numerous honey types. And while these honey types may be similar in many ways, each possess different flavors, colors, properties, and different compositions. Looking at the honeybee, and while there are thousands of species of bees, only 8 species of honeybees are recognized, with the dominant being the western honeybee, Apis mellifera. The breeding of honeybees is a science and an industry in itself, where the western honeybee has evolved over time to become the primary species maintained by beekeepers for the production of both honey and other bee-related products, as well as for pollination activities. I think Michelle previously touched on it, but it is worth noting that while legislation, for example, in the UK refers to honey as coming from Apis mellifera, it can obviously be also produced by many other species of honeybees, and the honey produced by other honeybee species is often more prized in their local origins. The workings of the hive and the interaction of the bees within the hive is a well-studied and fascinating subject, and one slide can in no way do it any justice, so I don't intend to do that. However, in simple terms, honeybees are social insects who display a reproductive division of labour. Hive numbers grow and contract through the year to ensure its survival, and there are 3 castes of honeybee in the hive: the drones, the workers, and the queens, and their lifespans vary. Drones are the male honeybee whose primary function is to mate with the queen. And for those that are worried, they cannot sting. Worker honeybees are non-reproductive females. Workers maintain and defend the colony as well as care for the brood. They undertake the majority of activities in the hive, including the collection of nectar from which honey is produced, and they can sting. The queens are responsible for producing all of the offspring within the hive, and at peak they can lay 2,000 to 3,000 eggs a day. And maintaining a healthy queen is obviously key to maintaining a healthy and productive hive. As beekeeping is technically seen as the management of livestock, it is regulated in many countries, including to a degree in the UK. In England, beekeepers in their facilities, for example extraction facilities, are not generally required to be registered, although some local councils do issue localised licences. All beekeepers in the UK are required by law to adhere to programmes for the control of notifiable bee diseases, such as European foul brood and American foul brood, as outlined in various acts, including the Bee Act from 1980. The National Bee Unit is heavily involved in bee health in the UK and delivers the bee health programmes on behalf of DEFRA. It's a recognised centre of excellence in the UK in the provision of advice and research in bee health, as well as hosting BeeBase, which is the APHA's web-based beekeeper database. Membership to the database is free of charge, and all beekeepers are encouraged to register the details of their bees and apiaries, as information on the distribution of beekeepers and their apiaries across the country can help in the monitoring and control of honeybee diseases and pests. Michelle has touched on some of this already. However, honey composition has been defined at both national and international level, and is done so in the UK by the 2015 honey regulations, which are separately legislated for in England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And internationally, we use we set ourselves up using Codex, which Michelle also referenced. Both the honey regulations and Codex are similar and define requirements for honey composition in general, particularly with respect to sugar content, moisture content, water insoluble content, electrical conductivity, free acid, diacid activity, and HMF content. However, where the Honey England regulations are mandatory, and as such may be used for enforcement purposes, as Michelle also referenced, those provided in the Honey Codex are entirely voluntary and are used as a basis for international trade. In addition, Codex covers honeys produced by all types of bees, whereas the honey regulations in the UK cover that by produced by the European honeybee or Apis mellifera. National standards do vary, and honey produced to or sold into a market needs to comply with the requirements of that particular market. Looking a little more detail at the honey regulations, it defines different honey types, where blossom honey is defined as such if it is derived from the nectar collected by bees from flowers. Honeydew can be called honeydew if it is derived from the sap exuded by insects feeding on plants, which are then collected by the bees. As highlighted in the previous slide, compositional quality criteria for a range of honeys are specified in the regulations. These are detailed on the tables, as you can see, where we look at the minimum content for the sugars, fructose, glucose, and sucrose in honey, the moisture content of honey, the electrical conductivity and acidity of honey, the diastase activity expressed in Shada units, and HMF. In the following section of slides, I'll look at some of the key aspects around the global honey trade and production. I understand this is quite a busy slide, so I'll explain it as best I can. And this figure illustrates the flow of honey in what is very much a global marketplace. The coloured lines that have been projected onto the representation here, which are purple, white, green, and blue, indicate the direction of trade, with the narrow end of each line indicating the country of export and the broad end the country of import. So as an example, if you take Argentina, which is here, exporting 67,000 tons at this particular point in time into the US. So you can see the narrow end of the line and the dark and the broad end of the line. And while honey is produced across the globe, there are two key buyers of honey, two key markets. One is Europe, which including the UK and the US. And you can see the lines coming into here and the heaviness of the lines. Both these markets are far from being self-sufficient and are dependent on imports, which exceed over 200,000 tons into each of those markets. The EU, including the UK, produces approximately 250,000 tons of honey, whilst the US produces 65 to 75,000 tons of honey annually. And we'll look at global honey production in a minute. And as can be seen, the honey coming into these markets is mainly coming from Asia and South America. And almost all of the honey produced in Africa is consumed internally in Africa. And the markets are very much interconnected. And any change that happens in the producer or importing country will impact elsewhere. So it's very much a domino effect, whether that's a change in legislation, or change in crop, or a change in market conditions. For the year 2019, it was estimated that there were in the region of 95 to 100 million hives worldwide, producing approximately 1.9 million tons. And we look at the detail of that in a minute. Just focusing on the UK, as per the last EU survey, which was taken when the UK was a member of the EU, from the UK perspective, there were just under 38,000 beekeepers registered, with 244,000 hives. And assuming hive yield or production per hive of approximately 20 kilos, that puts UK production at just under 5,000 tons. Most beekeepers in the UK are hobbyists. There are obviously commercial beekeepers in the UK, but the vast majority are hobbyists. And that's borne out by the average number of hives per beekeeper in the UK, which is at 6. However, when we look at honey production globally, most of the honey production globally that is traded is coming from commercial beekeepers. And commercial beekeepers operate to a different way, and they have different working methods than would hobbyist beekeepers. So staying with beekeepers and to understand beekeeping in Europe, it's worth looking at the surveys that they do every year in Europe as to the number of hives and the number of beekeepers present in each of the member states. I'm not sure how well people can see that, but on the left-hand side you can see the number of hives in thousands. So you could say, for example, in Spain, in 2020 there was 2.9 million hives. And the number of beekeepers is on the right-hand side. So again, if you can read the numbers there, the largest number of beekeepers was in Germany, where you looked at 129,000 beekeepers. First point to note is that the number of hives and beekeepers in the EU is growing. And over the last 2 to 3 years, it's up approximately 8 to 9%. The greatest concentration of hive, and as a consequence, honey production, is in Eastern and Southern Europe, with production in the EU at approximately 240,000 tonnes. Spain has the largest number of beehives in the EU, with just under 3 million being recorded for the year 2020. And in contrast to the UK, the average number of hives for beekeepers in Spain is in excess of 100. In terms of beekeepers, Germany has the largest number, but just under 130,000 being recorded or registered for the year 2020, approximately 21% of the registered beekeepers in the EU. And similar to the UK, they have an average of 7 hives per beekeeper and produce approximately 22 to 23 kilos per hive. Obviously, there's a lot of detail in this slide and in the slide prior to the previous one, which I'm sure people may have questions on as we go through. Looking at global honey production, this slide illustrates the distribution of production across the world in tonnes from the major producers. And this was done in 2017 by the FAO. They updated the numbers for 2019. However, a lot of countries were missing in terms of they didn't have any production in for them, so we haven't included that. So probably the best reference at this stage is 2017 in terms of total numbers. And as you can see from the table, just here the total production was just under 1.9 million tonnes. And the 80-20 rule very much applies. And that the top 20 countries accounted for just under 80% of global production. China is the largest producer of honey on a global basis, producing just under 30% of the world's honey. And as for the continents, Asia produces 49% of honey. Europe, including Eastern Europe, which includes Ukraine and Russia, which are significant producers in their own right, produces approximately 21%. America is North and South 18%, and Africa 11%. The balance, which is just over 1%, is coming from Australia and New Zealand. In terms of global honey production, the honey produced from a hive, as any beekeepers who are listening in know, can vary quite significantly, and does so from origin to origin. It's obviously dependent on the nectar sources and the weather within any particular origin, as well as the beekeeper's focus, skills and practices. Just to compare two different origins, looking at China, which is the world's largest producer of honey, the beekeeper, who usually has 100 to 200 hives, leads a very nomadic lifestyle, traveling the length and breadth in China with their hives. And we've included a few pictures of Chinese beekeepers. You can see their hives, and this is where they would live while they're traveling. The Chinese beekeepers will follow the various nectar sources as they come into bloom, starting in March, finishing up in September or so. And we'll talk about the cycle of honey in terms of a collection in a minute. And they'll extract the honey manually, and they will consolidate and transport that honey to an exporter, who is responsible for further processing of the honey to ensure it meets the specification of the end market. In contrast, New Zealand, where beekeepers all often have in excess of 1,000 hives, do not travel the same distances as the Chinese beekeepers do. The extraction facilities are permanent and very much automated. And the beekeepers are of such a scale that in some cases they're capable of supplying the volume to export markets themselves and do not need to access those markets via a consolidator or exporter. Although beekeeping has evolved with a view towards maximising the production of honey and other bee products such as beeswax, pollen, propolis and royal jelly, the fundamental principles remain the same, with the role of the beekeeper being to supervise and manage the health and population of the bees. While beekeeping practices vary, it remains a very highly skilled occupation that requires a great deal of knowledge, skill and expertise in order to maintain the bees and protect them from disease and starvation throughout the course of a year, with the intention to ensure that both the bees and hive are at optimal strength when the season begins and nectar sources become available. The beekeepers need to have an understanding of the timing and location of those nectar sources and to be able to react as and when they change. To give an example, acacia, which is obviously a highly prized and honey type in Europe and in Asia, blooms for a comparatively short period of maybe 2 to 3 weeks in whichever location it's in. And it also blooms in the spring, which is difficult because the bees may not necessarily be at their optimal strength at that point in time, so the beekeeper will have to get them there. And to maximise the acacia crop, the beekeeper needs to understand all factors at play in order to both locate and move his hives appropriately during the flowering period. And finally, they will know when to stop collecting the nectar, as they will not want other floral sources to overlap and to dilute the acacia that they have collected. In terms of the season, a beekeeper will generally collect honey in the spring and summer months. Springtime in the Northern Hemisphere falls between March and May, and between September and November in the Southern Hemisphere. The Northern Hemisphere summer is June to August, while in the Southern Hemisphere it is December to February. And the closer you get to the equator, the more blurred those lines become. So effectively, honey is collected throughout the 12 months of the year, depending on the location of where the honey is produced. For the Northern Hemisphere, the Northern Hemisphere countries collect honey from March to August, and the Southern Hemisphere from September to February. So we have a 12-month season in effect. Honey, when it's produced, is either classed as being monofloral or multifloral. The term monofloral honey refers to honey that comes either wholly or mainly from one nectar source, whereas multifloral honeys may come from multiple nectar sources. While beekeepers work in very different climatic conditions across the world, which determines how they operate, aside from the number of hives that they manage, the volume of honey collected is dependent on the number of variables. These include the hive strength and health, which the beekeeper manages throughout the year, the weather both in the months leading into and during the crop, the availability and abundance of nectar sources, and the beekeeper's mobility, in other words, their willingness and ability to follow those various nectar sources as they come to bloom during the spring and summer months. The more favourable these factors, the greater the number of times that a beekeeper can extract honey and increase the level of production. Larger commercial enterprises, some of which can have in excess of 20,000 hives, employ many beekeepers and manage their operations in a different way to that of the hobbyist beekeeper. And from a commercial perspective, the obvious focus is on increasing production yield. In terms of honey, monofloral honey is more difficult to produce, in that not only does the beekeeper have to manage the hives, but also needs to know about the suitable nectar sources, where they're located, what time of year they come into bloom, and allow for the weather, which is obviously quite unpredictable from season to season, And in most cases, they have a very short flowering period. While honey remains the focus for many beekeepers, additional bee products such as pollen, propolis, and royal jelly may also provide an income stream, as can crop pollination, which is an industry in its own right. However, this places a different set of demands on both the beekeeper and the honeybee. The beekeepers obviously have to manage the hive strength and the health of the hive, which are critical. As such, the beekeeper needs to pay close attention to the threat to the hive from mite infestation and fungal pathogens that affect the larvae or the adult bees. Of great concern are hive infections resulting from bacterial disease such as American foul brood and European foul brood. As previously mentioned, both of these diseases are classified as notifiable under the 1980 UK Government Bee Act, which will result in the destruction of the colony as well as other colonies in the immediate vicinity. Beekeepers need to constantly monitor and check their bees throughout the year to ensure they are free of disease. In terms of honey extraction, and this is just a basic run through, this slide shows the basic steps undertaken. And as previously referenced, depending on the scale of the beekeeper's operation as well, the need for mobility in following nectar sources, honey extraction can be done at a permanent location while travelling. Once the frames have been removed from the hive and prepared, they are spun and the honey is extracted. Once the honey is being extracted, it will need to go through filtration to remove any inorganic or organic matter, and excess moisture may also remove before or after extraction. The inorganic and organic matter that is normally present in honey tends to include bee parts, wax, hive debris, and so on. While excess moisture may be present due to climatic conditions, except humidity, or beekeeper practices where the beekeeper looks to maximize production of a particular honey or honey in general. The beekeeper also needs to ensure insoluble solids are removed and the level of insoluble solids present is legislated for under honey regulations at 0.1 grams per 100 gram. This is normally achieved by letting the honey settle in a tank and allowing the insoluble solids to rise where they're then removed. Honey is frequently heated to ensure that it can flow through filters and be processed, but the heating needs to be controlled as the composition of the honey will be affected. Particularly the HMF level is affected and needs to be controlled and is regulated, as is the case in the honey regulations. Moisture removal, which is practiced globally and is done for a variety of reasons, can also be undertaken by the beekeeper and may be necessary due to the prevailing environmental conditions, right? It's high humidity, or beekeeping practices, or in order to maintain the integrity of a monofloral honey. Removal of excess moisture can be performed using a variety of different techniques. And as with the filtration and heating, any impact on honey composition has to be managed in such a way to ensure that the honey complies with relevant regulations. Following the extraction process, the honey may be bottled for sale to local consumers or alternatively transferred to larger volume containers for transport through the supply chain to an intermediary packer or exporter. Blending of honey is standard practice, and blended honeys account for the vast majority of honey that is sold at retail level. As honey is a natural product, subject to changes in availability and quality, i.e. colour, taste, liquidity, and so on, the objective of blending honey from a packer's perspective is to provide a honey that is consistent in taste, colour, liquidity, price, and so on. The characteristics of a blend, including its price, are determined by the various brand holders in relation to their own market. The objective of the packer in blending is to manage the compositional characteristics of the various honey types, their origins, and the pricing of these honeys available to provide a consistent product. While the majority of honey sold at retail is done so as liquid, honey may also be creamed, which is what the process that you can see on the slide. And creamed honey ensures a smooth consistency where the crystallization process is carefully manipulated by the packer. In creaming honey, sugar crystals seeds are added and the honey is stored to ensure the even distribution of the seed crystals throughout the honey. The presence of these particular seed crystals helps promote the gradual and even crystallization of the honey, or that particular honey vat, which is stored at a constant and optimal temperatures for the process to take place. Having said that, creamed honey or set honey is a small part of the market in overall terms, which is predominantly liquid. Honey, when properly harvested and extracted correctly and correctly packed and appropriately stored, may maintain its compositional stability for many, many years. However, it is normal to put 2 years shelf life on honey, or normal within the UK. And shelf life is governed primarily by changes in HMF and diastase activity related to the values defined in both the honey regulations and Codex. Unprocessed honey can ferment at ambient temperatures due to the presence of yeast, or where the moisture and content and spore content are high. Processing with heat eliminates many microorganisms and helps reduce the moisture content, where moisture content below 18.5% is generally considered to be sufficient to retard yeast activity. However, the likelihood of honey crystallization increases with decreasing moisture content, and crystallization is very much an undesirable property from a honey packer's perspective in terms of its handling, processing and marketing, except where we produce creamed honey. And crystallization is managed in a number of different ways, depending on the origin, but it can be done according to the sugar composition of the various honeys, where we look at the sugar types and their ratios, the heat treatment to dissolve crystals. Some countries heat a lot more than others. Filtration, the removal of air bubbles, and finally the management and maintaining of temperature during storage. Again, whatever is done in terms of managing crystallization has to be done so to ensure that the honey is compliant with the honey regulations. In terms of the global supply chain, this following section describes some of the key aspects and includes details on export-import arrangements, supply chain vulnerability, and product traceability. Beekeepers, while they may sell honey locally in jars, but honey for export is filtered and shipped on a drum-by-drum basis in 300 kilo drums. When each honey is shipped for export, it is normally done in a 20-foot container containing 70 drums, approximately 20 tons. This container will have been shipped on leaving the exporter for its destination market and will be accompanied by an appropriate health certificate and the necessary documentation as set out by the receiving country. The authorities at the point of origin will often test or require proof that the honey conforms to the requirement of its destination market. And the consignment is normally usually subject to additional examination on arrival by local health authorities, as is done in the UK. During transportation, the container seal must remain intact, unless it is obviously broken by local health authorities when it arrives at its destination. Honey is also traded. Retail honey is also traded, but the same rules apply to bulk honey. And again, they have to comply to the regulations at the market of destination. Usually, honey is packed for sale in its destination country, so most of the trade is in bulk honey. And as standard practice for the consolidated or the exported, the origin market to homogenize in 20-ton lots and ensuring that 20-ton lot meets the required specification. The entire process of homogenization is documented, including the stirring time, and starts from the time when the mixing tank is being filled to the time that the drums are actually sealed. The homogenization process should be certified as being complete, and as with any part of the process, it should be part of the honey's traceability record. Aside from good practice, the consolidator exporter should test each beekeeper's honey as per their defined protocol, and this may include testing for composition, residue, and authenticity to ensure content conforms to specification before it's homogenized. Obviously, there's a big risk for the consolidator exporter that a rogue lot from a rogue beekeeper could potentially damage the whole 20 tons of honey. It's a big risk financially. Once homogenized, the honey is deemed fit for export. And at this point, representative samples will be taken, often by a third party acting on behalf of the buyer in the end market, as well as the exporter. An analysis is then undertaken to ensure that the honey meets the specification and is fit for its end market, and is normally released on a positive release basis. In addition to product testing, traceability is also necessary to ensure the product's integrity. Depending on the buyer, a sample of the honey for export may be sent to the importer, who may decide to test it in order to ensure it complies with the relevant regulations and export specification before allowing that honey consignment to be shipped. When the honey is loaded into a container, the container is sealed, and again, depending on the buyer, a third party will also seal the drums within that container after the sample has been taken. Where a packer is of sufficient scale, the container will often arrive direct from the origin to the packer's premises, and it is that point that the seals are broken. It is expected that the packer will again test the honey to ensure it conforms to specification with respect to the compositional, residue, and authenticity requirements of the particular destination. The British Honey Importers and Packers Association has a code of practice, which is compiled in conjunction with the LGC, and which imported honey consignments are required to adhere to. Prior to the UK withdrawing from the EU, border checks on consignments coming from the EU were frequently waived. However, following the UK's withdrawal, EU honey is now treated similar to imported honey from other third countries and is checked at the border. Regardless of origin, all imported honey must be shipped with the necessary documentation, including health certificates. And that necessary documentation must comply to all the rules as set out in the product of animal origin regulations. I think Michelle previously mentioned, in addition to the mandatory documentation, up to 15% of consignments will be checked at the UK border. And in many cases, this involves the opening of containers and samples being taken, which are subsequently tested to ensure they comply to the regulations. In terms of product traceability, while there may be variations because of the scale of beekeepers' operations or an exporter's operations, there are a minimal set of operational steps from the beekeeper at origin to the packer, which we've outlined on the right-hand side of the slide. And it is expected a clear record of traceability can be provided at all times to cover these steps. At the packer, the honey will go through a number of processing steps. First, the honey is going to be decanted from the drums, a process which will involve the application of heat, and the honey will likely be crystallized at this point in time. The honey is then further heated in order to enable it to pass through the various filtration and blending steps before it is finally packed. Heating and filtration are carefully controlled to ensure the honey is packed as per the compositional requirements. In most cases, honey blending is a simple process, where honeys with different characteristics are mixed, i.e. stirred, and the honey is packed as liquid. However, when the honey is packed as previously referenced as a set or creamed honey, a number of additional steps are required, which we previously spoken about. But as previously stated, all steps must be documented and clearly defined. The traceability itself and the paperwork associated should cover all steps from the packed product back to the beekeeper, accounting for all the processes in between, including that done by the packer and the exporter. Each process needs to be documented, and each lot detailed with a clear link through each process to any of the documentation that's required, i.e. the bills of lading, the health certificates, the test results, beekeepers' records, delivery records, and so on. Traceability and quality obviously can be compromised where further steps are involved. And as honey does go through blending steps other than homogenization, it's important that to keep these steps to a minimum. It's good practice to keep traceability in the supply chain as direct as possible. And prior to arriving at the final packer, the only blending or homogenization of the honey that should take place is that of the beekeeper's lots. Situation can become more complicated where different blended lots are blended before they arrive at a packer, at the final packer. And this can occur at origin or by somebody who's trading the honey on in between. Aside from the extra steps potentially involving different facilities, it may also be that somebody is blending to dilute or to remove an issue with the honey. We've seen this happen in the past with monofloral honeys, such as acacia or manuka, where lower grade monofloral honeys are blended with standard or acceptable monofloral products and obviously sold at a premium. It can also happen where lots which possessing high levels of pesticide or antibiotics, and these are blended with residue-free lots in order to dilute the presence of the contaminants and to get them in under the required levels. It can also happen where premium honeys coming from a specific origin are blended with non-premium honeys coming from different origins and then sold on as a premium, masking the origin of the honey. As with any food product, the potential to commit fraud, which is the intentional deception to secure unfair or unlawful gain, exists with honey. The main area of concerns for honey are the mislabeling of origin, mislabeling of the honey type, the evasion of duty, and the adulteration / dilution with sugar syrups. Food fraud can be introduced at various points along the supply chain. And what is obvious is that the greater the gain, the greater the risk of this happening. So most relevant in terms of high value honeys. The elimination of the opportunity fraud may be addressed through obtaining detailed knowledge and understanding of the supply chain and the processes involved at each stage in the chain. Some of the primary methods for the control of fraud include the implementation of robust traceability and audit programs, simplifying the steps in the supply chain, and undertaking product testing for authenticity at various points in the chain. In addition, the undertaking of a VASP, vulnerability assessment critical control point evaluation, is highly recommended to both understand and manage the associated risks. The EU conducted an EU-wide survey in 2015 to look at the issue of fraud in honey, and the results are summarised in the table on the right for both the EU and the UK. And while issues were noted in the UK, it is clear that greater issues existed in other parts of the European Union.
We've just decided, Carol, to extend the webinar till 5 p.m, so we've got some time for Q&A. Can I just ask you to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, please? Thank you.
Okay. Just to summarise, and I'll summarise as quickly as I can. The commercial honey supply chain, as we know, goes from the bees and their surroundings directly through to the beekeeper who manages the hive health and honey extraction. Consolidator who combines multiple honey lots ready for transport. The honey then passes through an exporter who generally prepares it for bulk transport and ensures it meets the required specification before shipping. Exported honey is normally received by the packer who will generally test it to ensure that it meets the specification before it's placed on the market. Beekeeping is considered livestock management and is regulated as such in many countries, although the regulations vary between different countries. Beekeeping regulations primarily restrict the trade in bees and enforce control measures for notifiable bee diseases. And as Michelle previously commented on, honey composition is strictly defined at national and international level through the honey regulations in the UK and Codex. Honey can be classified as either coming from the blossom or honeydew, where blossom honey is derived from the nectar collected by the bees from flowering plants and honeydew from the sap. In addition, blossom honey can be classified as either monofloral or multifloral honeys, where monofloral honey is defined as coming wholly mainly from a single nectar source. Honey is collected throughout the year, as we went through the seasons, and there's in effect a 12-month season there, depending on which part of the world you're in. In terms of honey production, China is the largest honey producer in the world, producing just under 30% of the world's honey. Honey for export is filtered and shipped on a drum-by-drum basis. Normally travels in 20-foot containers with 70 drums per container in 20-ton lots. Normally, honey is packed for sale in its destination market, although there is some trade in retail packed honey, but it's small in comparison to what's traded in bulk. The consolidator or exporter at origin tests the honey to ensure it's in accordance with their defined protocol and it meets the necessary specification for its end markets. Typically, these tests will look at the compositional qualities of the honey, the residue and authenticity. Traceability back to the beekeeper must be available and should cover all steps from the beekeeper to the packed product, inclusive of all the processes undertaken in between. The main concerns for honey fraud that we outlined were the mislabeling of origin, mislabeling of the honey type, evasion of duty, and adulteration with sugar syrups. Honey is very much a shelf-stable product, although we usually put 2 years shelf life on it. And in terms of establishing a suitable shelf life for honey, it's covered primarily by changes in its diastase activity and HMF levels relative to those set out in the honey regulations. I've wrapped it up as quick as I can there, Silverani, so I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Kyle. That's a really comprehensive look at the global honey supply chain. There are lots of questions in the chat, and I'm very pleased that some of the attendees have been kind enough to answer each other's questions, which was nice to see. I'll start at the top and start with a couple of questions, and I think around the legislation. Michelle, one for you. Does DEFRA have any plans to amend the honey regulations?
I think we don't have any plans to amend them in the immediate term. I think the belief at the moment is that they do provide a sound base for consumer and industry protection. We recently actually carried out a post-implementation of the 2015 regulations, so it's a PIR, which is a review, which is legislated for. It's mandatory, and Parliament requires us to review legislation every 5 years. And we consulted stakeholders on that, and I mean, broadly speaking, most people were relatively happy with the regulations as they as they stand at the moment. I mean, I think that's not to say that now that we've left the EU that we wouldn't, going forward in this sort of more medium to long term, that we wouldn't look again at the honey rules and others, but obviously it will be up to ministerial ambitions as well in that space. Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle.
I've answered your questions, so yeah.
Yeah, that does. I think it was a follow-up question around the EU, and obviously I know we've left the EU, but they're still one of our largest trading partners. What if the EU amended the honey directive? Would we introduce similar changes? I think there was some talk about the Slovenian regulator wanting to introduce a country of origin labelling for honey. Would we do the same?
I think, well, I mean, first of all, we haven't seen those EU proposals. I'm aware that I think it's the Slovakian presidency is quite keen on country of origin for blended honey. I mean, obviously, country of origin is mandatory for honey. It's just the blends that where, you know, we've, as I said in my talk, where we've provided for alternatives. But so, firstly, I think we need to see what the EU proposals are. I don't think there's anything on the table. And we need to look at the merits of that proposal. Obviously, as I mentioned, any EU rules would apply any changes to EU rules would apply in Northern Ireland. So we would, I mean, I think basically we would want to consult our stakeholders, look in depth at what are being proposed, and go from there.
Great, thank you, Michelle. There were a couple of questions at the top around the use of the term raw honey.
Okay, is that for me or for
That's for you, Michelle. It's labelling, so I'm coming to you there.
In terms of, I haven't read through all the chat. It just
said too much. 2 or 3, and they said, "What is your view on the use of the term raw honey?"
Okay.
What about the word raw?
So I think, generally speaking, I think a number of trading standards organisations, I think have already sort of ruled on that, and they have consulted DEFRA on it, and we do agree that we generally would not want to see the term raw honey used, and that's based on the fact that well, it's going back to look at sort of basically dictionary definitions of what's raw, what's cooked. So honey, you know, generally speaking, within the legislation shouldn't be heated. It should only, there is a provision of a temperature actually in the regulations. It should only be heated to get it out of the drum or out of necessity. So we wouldn't. All honey, we would say, is raw honey. We would not say that honey is cooked, and therefore differentiating between raw and cooked, you know, we don't think would be appropriate. So, no, we would not be in favour of that, and I don't think the most TSOs or EHOs take that view either. So, if you're using the term raw honey, you know, we don't believe that's within the spirit of the regulations. Okay,
thank you very much, Michelle. Moving on, there was a question from Paul Malin on weight of evidence. He says that weight of evidence is not helpful as a term without clear criteria to work as a basis. How do you explain the weight of evidence to a court? I was just going to mention that there is some follow-up work that DEFRA, FSA, FSS and the government chemists are planning. There's a specific stream on weight of evidence for this very reason, that it can be complex. Honey is a complex issue. Some of the testing around and the interpretation is complex. So a task group has been formed that's been DEFRA-led on weight of evidence, looking at best practice from other areas, such as the forensic sector, where weight of evidence is used quite a lot, and how we can learn from that into some practical guidance that we can put out there for people working in this area. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Michelle.
No, I mean, I think exactly as you said, we do have a programme of work going forward on honey, and one of those is weight of evidence. And we're looking at getting sort of information from various experts and drawing up some criteria. Hear me? Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Also, yeah, I think it's the network at my end. Yeah, okay, great. And there was a question from Stephen Butler about, I think you mentioned, Michelle, in your definition about the fact that it was European bees. But the question was around Chinese honeys. Aren't they produced by the Asian honeybees? So would that make them out of scope in terms of being defined as honey?
I think probably Catherine probably knows better than me on that one, but that's not my understanding. Cathal, do you?
Yeah, the vast majority of honey produced, not alone in China, but globally, is produced using the European honeybee.
Yeah, that was my understanding, but I wouldn't like to. Yeah. I mean, otherwise, yes, the European, obviously, rules are more restrictive.
Okay, great. I think that answers that one. Moving on, I think there was a question around, must everyone in the UK producing honey, even in small quantities, register with their local authorities? I think that's one that actually some of the participants answered, but I didn't know if you wanted to say. Yeah, yes.
I think so.
Okay. There was
certainly if you're I think certainly if you're selling honey, then you need to be registered. And FSA have lots of guidance on the FSA website, has lots of guidance on how to register as a food business.
Good, thank you. And there was there's quite a few questions around Chinese honey and moisture reduction. So between you both, Cal and Michelle, I know the ISO group, the Standardization Committee, is looking at the definition of honey, and I didn't know if you want to address that.
I mean, moisture reduction is that not just confined to China, it's pretty much practiced on a global basis in various different forms and at various different levels. But the topic is being discussed at an ISO level to try and understand what's happening globally and what might be appropriate.
Yes, so I think we agree that it is an issue that needs discussing, and it's being discussed by experts at this ISO committee. There was a comment here about the US honey standards have been updated recently to include a list of tests that are more appropriate in the person's view, including LCEA or IRMS and some of the other more modern techniques. And there's a question to Michelle or Cathal or both in terms of, is the UK thinking of updating its testing methodology in line with the changing nature of honey?
I don't think the US honey standard has actually been updated, if I'm correct. I think it's the US Pharmacopoeia definition of honey has been put together, which references a number of tests. That's not the US honey definition as such.
Okay. So it's the US Pharmacopoeia that's put together.
I think that's what's happened, yeah.
I mean, the only point to make on that is obviously the regulations themselves don't stipulate particular methods to be used, and that's not, that's not the way we tend to, the route that we tend to go down, and you would expect that appropriate methods are being used by trading standards, by commercial laboratories that have been obviously validated, and the reference that we make is we have now actually changed to include that reference in the actual regulations, that we would support the use of internationally validated methods for testing of honey, but recognise obviously there is a recognition that new methods are coming on stream, but we would hope that laboratories, or we would expect laboratories to be ensuring that they are validated in-house and amongst their counterparts before sort of being offered for testing, or to say whether a product is what it says it is. Obviously, Silver, you're in that sort of area, so you can probably comment on that as well. What you would expect to see as a laboratory offering testing.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. In terms of the regulations, there's a move away from specifying individual methods, more to performance-related method, or looking at what the requirement is. And I think in the chat, someone's actually referenced a blog that Rick Mumford from the FSA did that gives an outline of the programme of work that government's planning in this area. And I think everyone on the call appreciates this is a complex area, and there are no overnight solutions or one definitive test that gives you a right or wrong answer. So rightly or wrongly, it is a whole suite of evidence that you need in order to say whether something is as labelled or not, and that's the only thing that we can go on. just following up on the testing point, there was a comment here from James Guanis, I think hopefully I've pronounced that right, who says that a good publicly scrutinised data bank of honey is necessary at this point. And I didn't know if, Carol, you wanted to mention some of the work that the Honey Association is doing with FERA on your database? Yes,
certainly there's been a lot of debate and a lot of issue around databases and the comprehensiveness and representativeness of databases that have been put together by the commercial laboratories. So as the UK Honey Association working with FERA, we set about trying to put a database of honeys that are sold in the UK marketplace, and obviously put in place the protocols to ensure that any honeys that go into that database justify them as being authentic honeys. And that's the key, to ensure that the honeys that are going into the database are authentic, and also that they are representative of honeys that are sold in a particular market or honeys that are produced globally. And therein lies the difficulty. If you remember at the start of the presentation, I said that there are thousands and thousands of different sources, nectar sources available, and there are many different ecosystems and environmental conditions and beekeeping practices which influence the composition of honey. And it's going to be very difficult to come up with a fully comprehensive database to represent all of that. We will try our best.
Yeah, thanks for that, Carol. It's now 4:59, and I know we overran a little bit on the presentation, so thanks for bearing with us. There are lots and lots of questions in the chat. I know Michelle very kindly provided her email address at the end of her presentation, so when the recording comes out, if there is a burning question that you want Michelle to answer, then please email her. We'll also put an email address in the chat for the Government Chemist email group, so that if there are any unanswered questions that you really would like an answer to, we can look at those after the webinar, and Elena will post that email address in the chat, as I said. So all it remains for me to say is thank you very much to Michelle and Carol for giving us these excellent talks today and continuing the debate on honey. And thank you all to the participants for joining us and for so actively participating in the meeting chat. Please take a few minutes to fill in the feedback form so that we can improve future webinars. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.